Welcome everyone to our third spring 2022 BNHA It's More Than History lecture series. I am the Peel's first artist fellow. Live captions and ASL interpretation are provided for all of our events. Captions are underneath the video player on our website and can be adjusted for size, color, and contrast. We are recording. This event will last 1 hour. You can email online at thepillcenter.org for technical help. You can also reach us on social media. We are at The Peel on Twitter and Facebook, and The Peel Baltimore on Instagram. The handles being shared in the comments box on the live viewing webpage for you see here. We invite you to write your questions in the chat box on the webpage you are watching this through at any time throughout the discussion. Any donations you make during this program will go to supporting the Baltimore National Heritage Area's work and ensuring that programs like this can continue to be free for all in the future. Thank you for giving what you can. We begin by acknowledging with humility that the lands where the Peel and Baltimore are situated today are the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of Piscataway, Lenape, and Susquehannock indigenous peoples. The vast coastal area today known as Baltimore City, Maryland, sustained indigenous peoples until the arrival of Europeans, beginning in the 1600s. Over the next 400 years, many Piscataway, Lenape, and Susquehanna communities were decimated, absorbed by larger villages or tribes, and or forced by the U.S. federal government to move west beyond the Mississippi River with larger tribes. Since then, other tribal peoples have moved here in diaspora, including Lumbee peoples. On January 9th, 2012, two tribes of Piscataway, the Piscataway Conoy tribe, and the state also recognized the Accahanic Indian tribe. We acknowledge the Peel stands on stolen lands. This history was adapted from an original text authored by Ryan A. Coons, Peter Dayton, and Ashley Menner of the Lumbee tribe. Now I'd like to introduce Shantae Daniels, Executive Director of the Baltimore National Heritage Area and producer of It's More Than History lecture series.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking your time, your hour to be with us, to hear our lecturer on this great spring day. It's finally arrived. I'd like to introduce our lecturer for today, Mr. Paul Chaat Smith. He is a curator at the National Museum of Native Americans in Washington, D.C., a Smithsonian institution. And he is also the author of a wonderful book, Everything You Know About Indians is Wrong. So I welcome to the stage Paul Chaat Smith, and he will give you a little insight and provocative thought about Native Americans.
Thank you, Shantae. Good afternoon, people of Baltimore and planet Earth. 2018, a hell of a year. My hit show Americans opened on the National Mall in Washington in January and won glowing reviews from the New Yorker and the LA Times and the BBC and the PBS NewsHour, a bunch of places Smithsonian shows rarely are noticed. All the other curators were jealous, or at least so I imagined. The show cost millions and took years. It was one of those rare projects where the stars align and the right people are on the team and the director buys in 100%. And even when you blow right through the budget, as one does, it all comes together better than you could have imagined. The show is based on my essays about romanticism and thinking about the phenomenon I named Indians Everywhere. How can it be that Native American names and imagery are ubiquitous in American life, yet actual Native Americans are mostly invisible? For the show, we built a vast room, 100 feet by 300, filled it with hundreds of things that proved our point: a flight-tested Tomahawk missile, a vintage Indian motorcycle, clips from Seinfeld and South Park, and centuries of products that had nothing to do with Indians, yet they have Indians plastered all over their packaging. What we argue is that rather than simply being kitsch and stupid and racist, Indians everywhere is a deeply weird, mysterious, subversive phenomenon that warranted closer study. Indians are a tiny percentage of the United States, yet our presence is everywhere. On the names of a third of the states in the country, countless rivers and towns and weapon systems, sports teams, streets, well, you name it. Why? We answered the question this way. Americans, in their bones, know that the United States was built at devastating cost to Native people. They aren't sure how to think about this, and they rarely do consciously. This imagery, the wallpaper of American life, is a constant reminder in the background. It's just there, and it's been there from your earliest memories. It says, pay no attention, nothing to see here. Nothing weird about Native American images and names surrounding Americans 24/7. That dream catcher on the family minivan, just a cool piece of art. Good luck too. No reason to discuss it or anything. But bringing out this phenomenon into the light, paying attention, exploring how it works and what it does, that was a fault line we chose to investigate. The party line, meaning my party of Native intellectuals, says this whole thing is awful. And they're right, it is. But to me, it's also kind of great, kind of beautiful and optimistic. 2 centuries of pop culture reveals a profound connection between Americans and American Indians. It shows that the American people oppose amnesia. It says Indians are the most American thing ever. In the exhibition, we compared the motorcycles and headdress-wearing presidents, fashion models and pop stars, and Kanye West tour merchandise to the tip of an iceberg and said, let's check out what's under the waterline. So we looked at moments that profoundly shaped American history: the life of Pocahontas, Thanksgiving, the Trail of Tears, and the Battle of Little Bighorn. And stealing an idea from that Greil Marcus book, Dead Elvis, who looked at the king's career after he died, we built a timeline on how the memory of those events changed over time. So this afternoon, I'm going to focus on the story we told about the Trail of Tears. Here's the one most people know: that a bad man named Andrew Jackson put thousands of Cherokee Indians on a death march across the Mississippi River. It is understood today as a grave injustice, a shameful episode in American history. Nobody today says, hey, that was pretty cool. I didn't care for this version. It was sentimental, devoid of context, and generated more pity than insight. Fortunately, recent scholarship offered a new way to look at the event. In this version, Trail of Tears was just one moment in a much larger project, one that cost fortunes, spanned decades, transformed national borders, and reshaped the global economy. My team always wanted to find ways to make these iconic, quote, Indian stories, unquote, into American history. Because what I found is that Indian stories are nearly always about Indians as victims and focus on Indian suffering and tragedy. But what were they really? Politics, the deliberate functioning of a nation becoming an empire. Indians were at the center, but the canvas was much larger than the Cherokee or Andrew Jackson. The Indian Removal Act, narrowly passed by Congress in 1830, launched the effort. The goal, you will not be surprised to learn, was to remove Indians. The language never specified which ones, though everyone knew it was aimed at those in the American South. It was a backwater in those days, yet visionaries, including Jackson, believed it could become something else, the Garden of America. Lots was going on. Tobacco, the most important cash crop for decades, had exhausted the farmland in the mid-Atlantic. People didn't know about rotating crops back then. A new cash crop was taking off, cotton. Tobacco was out, cotton was king. Enslaved laborers were sent down the river to these new plantations. There was a problem, namely the presence of intact Indian nations scattered across the Deep South. Some of them were on incredibly valuable land, perfect for cotton. Others were not farmland at all, but they were in the way. The region needed roads and railway lines, and these annoying red nations were holding everything up. The old version said, "What a terrible tragedy, shed a tear for the Cherokee." Our version said, "The Indian Removal Act and the profound changes it brought were the biggest event in American history between the Revolution and the Civil War." As for AJ, give credit where credit or blame is due. Andrew Jackson was a key architect. But the support for removal of Native Americans in one form or another went as far back as Thomas Jefferson. And get this, Jackson wasn't even president when the Trail of Tears happened. We focused on this as a national project, robustly debated and narrowly enacted. Opponents in Congress correctly predicted the future where this would be seen as a catastrophic mistake, causing damage to America's standing in the world. It was a disaster that took place in broad daylight. And a dozen years later, after the passage of the Indian Removal Act, the future the supporters predicted actually came true. The backwater region had become the Garden of America. The richest citizens in the whole country lived in zip codes in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. The explosion of cotton didn't just make them rich, it made capitalists in New England and London rich too. It worked. The end result repaid the bold gamble many times over, at least until 1861, that is. In the early 1800s, the enslavement industry was in decline. Abolitionists believed victory was in sight. The US outlawed the importation of Africans. England banned slavery in 1807. All of this changed because turning that backwater into the Garden of America required an explosion in the number of enslaved human beings and the exile of Native Americans. There's no cotton kingdom without millions of slave laborers. The final true accounting, tens of thousands of Indians forcibly removed to Oklahoma, plus thousands who died on the journey. By 1861, 4 million human beings were held in bondage, finally liberated by the bloodiest war in American history. So far, so good, right? The exhibition privileged the larger, wider view, the bigger picture, and the economics that drove the politics. It was great, except for one problem that we had. The starring indigenous nations in this drama, the ones who fought removal the hardest, were slave states themselves. Given the patronizing title of the 5 civilized tribes, that because they were led by Christians, they were passionate supporters of enslavement. These 5, the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Seminole, Choctaw. John Ross, the famous Cherokee leader who led the resistance to removal, was a slave owner, and so were his top lieutenants. And this is when, curatorially speaking, history isn't a frenemy anymore, or even an enemy. History becomes a mangy, snarling dog, standing between you and your cozy home with a burning fireplace, dinner on the stove, and a crowd-pleasing narrative. Obviously, the story should be and needs to be that the enslaved Black people and the soon-to-be exiled Red people would join forces and defeat their common oppressor, or at least rise up and kick some ass. That's what the story should be. That's what I need the story to be. And that's what my public needs a story to be. But the mangy, snarling dog won't stand down. If I had a shotgun, maybe I would shoot it, but I'm no dog killer. So the mangy, snarling dog of history is this: the irrefutable historical record that shows the 5 civilized tribes were deeply committed to slavery, established their own racialized black codes, immediately reestablished slavery after removal when they arrived in Indian Territory, rebuilt their nations in Oklahoma with slave labor, crushed slave rebellions, and enthusiastically sided with the Confederacy in the Civil War. Do you want to hear that? I don't think so. Nobody does. So yes, we went there. In the Americans exhibition, we call the 5 civilized tribes slave states. And let me say that in case anyone thinks I have it in for the Cherokee, they can consult texts I've written about my own tribe, the Comanche, and they're much more harsh than anything I'm saying here. While researching the Americans exhibition, I discovered a thrilling account of how the Cherokee Nation's top leaders, including John Ridge and Elias Boudinot, staged a brilliant campaign in 1832 to win the support of abolitionists, even as the abolitionists were upset that both men, and really pretty much the entire ruling class of the Cherokee, were slave owners. Ridge and Boudinot lied and obfuscated and promised to quit running ads for escaped slaves in their famous newspaper, The Phoenix. And in the end, they kept the support of the legendary William Lloyd Garrison. And it becomes obvious that the Cherokees saved their alliance because the white supporters rationalized that the Cherokee would eventually give up slavery, but weren't there yet. In other words, they believed Indians couldn't really be expected to make the same moral choices as a white man. And of course, the justification for removal by Jackson and others was eerily similar. They said they weren't trying to destroy Indians. Indians were okay. They just needed a few decades to catch up because they weren't yet civilized. Meanwhile, Boudinot and Ridge and Ross were laughing their asses off because they played their allies without their allies even knowing they'd been played. As historian Natalie Joy explained, the abolitionists believed, as did most Americans, in the myth of the noble savage, whose innocence of civilization was a source of his virtuous purity, but also his greatest weakness, for it left him vulnerable to the introduction of unwanted vices, including, in this instance, slavery. Moral responsibility could only be expected of fully civilized people, not partially civilized Indians. Anti-slavery reformers latched onto this theory, despite the fact Boudinot and others were actually trained lawyers, Christians, highly educated and prosperous, for it not only explained how Indians became slaveholders, but offered the hope that with time and under the guidance of missionaries and reformers, they might progress enough to abandon civilization's vices. Partially civilized Indians might be slave owners. Fully civilized would become emancipators. And what was really happening is that Ridge and Boudinot performed precisely as capable and highly motivated national leaders should, making arguments and deals that advance their interests. Their goal was to prevent removal and steady a key alliance with abolitionists. Like skilled diplomats the world over, they did what they had to do, which in this case was tell big fat lies about Indian slave owning. So when I think about the bogus versions of this history I've learned over the past decades, the justification for making something plain as day, complicated and mysterious and fictive has the same root today as it did in 1832. That is, a desperate search for some alternative explanation. But there's no need for an alternative explanation. The Cherokee owned slaves for the same reason their white neighbors did. They knew exactly what they were doing. And to their credit, when they weren't spitting lies to abolitionists, they were remarkably consistent. John Ross, the Cherokee leader, said many times that African servitude, as he called it, was a settled question in his nation. What I believe is that we can't find common ground if we're stuck in the quicksand of provably false narratives. And as we all know, the United States has been involved in a constant and robust debate about the Civil War, the likes of which haven't been seen since, well, the end of the Civil War. And at the center of that debate has been the physical artifacts, trophies actually, of the genius marketing campaign called the Lost Cause, those ugly statues that litter whole regions of the country. The Cherokee have never downplayed their role in fighting for the Confederacy, and so they have their own Confederate memorial in Tahlequah, which makes it awkward to participate in the national conversations about the Great Reckoning of 2020. For the exhibition, I thought a lot about the cost of foregrounding this narrative. I felt certain I was on solid, if not common ground. I was angry at Native scholars who tiptoed around the issue because I felt objectively they were siding with tribal governments who denied their past history and continued policies that disenfranchised our Black citizens. As much as I support tribal sovereignty, and I know criticisms of tribal governments can always be used by our enemies, I also knew I had to take sides. And the tribal governments would only change in response to pressure. It was intellectually inexcusable for us to talk about the explosion of the Cotton Kingdom without talking about the 5 civilized tribes as slave states. Yet, I thought of what a Choctaw visitor, let's say a young teenager, would think after excitingly finding a panel in Americans with a photo of an important tribal leader she's probably heard of, a man named Greenwood LaFleur. The panel I wrote tells her he owned 400 human beings and lived in Mississippi in a house modeled after one built by Napoleon in France. And she learns her nation sided with the Confederacy. She learns her nation brought slavery to Indian territory. Native people come to my museum expecting uplift and positive stories, which we provide overwhelmingly. But visitors don't see the whole museum. They see the pieces that they see. And it could be irrelevant to them if we've said nice things about the Choctaw at other times, or that we hosted a Choctaw festival a few years ago. I've been thinking a lot about how much we need stories that make sense of chaos and how much we need heroes. The false narrative that somehow African Americans and Native Americans were allied is one that should be true, but it isn't. And if you dig deeper, you find a lot of stuff you'd rather know about. The narrative in Americans, the exhibition, offers bracing, unwelcome clarity and asks visitors to consider Cherokee leaders as heroes in defending their homelands against a racist and unjust policy, and villains who believed deeply and fought for their right to own Africans. So if we take away the heroism of John Ross, we leave visitors without a hero, and people need heroes. Maybe we shouldn't, but we do. I sometimes wonder if it's worth it. I mean, there's no shortage of verified awful events, past and present, to contemplate. What is the value of a more accurate history if that history crushes dreams and hope? I have a response to that, of course, that we'll never figure things out if we're operating from fairy tales. But is that enough? And yet things are changing. The Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma has new leadership, which finally removed that Confederate statue in Tahlequah. They affirm that Black freemen as full citizens and have begun to acknowledge their slaveholding past as a shameful episode in their history. Other slaveholding tribes haven't moved as fast, but I'm hopeful they will. While researching removal, I came across a quote so stunning I wasn't sure it was even real until I traced it back to the primary source. It's from John Ross, the flawed hero of our story, and appears in a long text written in 1837, titled Letter from John Ross, the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, to a gentleman of Philadelphia. Buried in a dense paragraph about the fraudulent treaty that dealt a devastating blow to the campaign against removal, he writes, quote, "The perpetrator of a wrong never forgives his victim." I've read this many times. The perpetrator of a wrong never forgives his victim. Ross was writing about a dude named Schermerhorn and the Seminoleans, which I guess is what they called the Seminoles back then. But I don't care about any of that specific context. John Ross, I believe, was writing to us, the people of the future, about himself, a committed slave owner and freedom fighter, both victim and perpetrator, trapped in contradiction, and like the rest of us, forever chased by the mangy dogs of history. Thanks for listening.
Wow. Thank you very much, Paul. I was just listening to you and thinking about a lot of what you're saying. But the only thing that is like really stuck in my head is that we had a land acknowledgement at the beginning of the program. So a lot of museums and organizations are now putting that particular acknowledgement in their introductions. I'd really like to know what you think as a Native American about land acknowledgements. Are they good? Are they bad? Indifferent?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. One of the chapters in my second book was called "The Ground Beneath Our Feet," and it was in response to questions people like me get when you address non-Indian audiences, which is, wow, this is amazing, it's interesting. What should I read? What should I learn about? What should I do? And, you know, some people would say you should read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, or you should read this or that other book, or something like that. And when I came to believe it was more important to like look at the history of the place where you live, wherever that is, because at some point that reveals American history, and Indians are always present in American history. So whether you live in, you know, Vermont or Idaho or Florida, it doesn't matter. But if you look at that, your own town a little bit, that can be more helpful to me than to revisit the Plains Wars or, you know, a series of atrocities and massacres. So I'm very sympathetic with the intent of that, which is what a land acknowledgement does, is say this place where we are now, and this one is talking about Baltimore, you know, is an Indian place that has an Indian history, and in this gathering, we are going to remember it. So that part, I mean, I can hardly be against that because that's what I've advocated myself. I think there was something unseemly. This started in Canada quite a few years ago. It was getting some traction in the US in the past several years, but certainly 2020 accelerated that. So I have artist friends in New York that were talking about the land acknowledgement arms race among the big museums in New York to get their right land acknowledgement with the right input from the right Indians really fast. And it felt unseemly because the basic truth of these things hasn't changed, right? It was as true in 1920 as it is today. And all of a sudden, obviously, because of the events of 2020, you know, the uprising in the wake of George Floyd's death made it urgent. And sometimes it felt like it's more important that our nonprofit, our museum, our cultural center do this now while people are looking, because we'll look bad if we're late to that event. And so that was that. A lot of us sort of looked askance at that. And then also it really does feel like it fits the definition of something being performative in some ways. And it always was like at the Smithsonian, we talked about, so like every event you're going to read this thing, or you're only going to read some events, and then you're saying, well, it's only, you know, it just felt like something difficult to sustain, even though the intent, I think, is genuine. the problem with what I was recommending, learn the history of your own place, that history is usually really intricate. So of course you had Native advisors work on the one you did, and it's certainly I can't imagine doing better than what they did for that. But it feels insufficient, yet it is not something I would say, oh, it's a waste of time. I think what a lot of people look for is something sustained over time, even if it's not more than just like thinking about it sometimes. There were some land acknowledgements, not this one, that do a lot of thanks for the native people. And it sometimes felt like you're thanking, your laborers who kept the North 40 in good shape for you so you could move in. So, you avoided all that. But it sort of becomes a discussion about the land acknowledgement versus how do we understand more completely the history of, the Mid-Atlantic. And that's hard. That's hard. There's not a simple thing. So it's probably an insufficient answer, but I'm kind of all over the place on this.
No, I think that's fair enough because, like I said, after, I don't know, a few hundred years, now all of a sudden after the death of one black man, and there have been so many black men before him, now all of a sudden we recognize, oh, we need to thank the Indians for where we are. So it's going to be at each organization's decision, at the leadership, whether they use them and that they're recognized. But I really wanted to have your opinion. That the one that we do in Baltimore was actually co-written by a Lumbee tribe member, Ashley Minor. So we accept that she's accepted it because she was a co-author. We're not sure about the other two authors, whether they were part of a Native American tribe. I'm curious to know one more thing. At this point in 2021, how many Native American tribes are exist or that are recognized?
Yeah, so it changes, every year. It's 520 something federally recognized tribes, and there's state recognized tribes in the U.S. And of course, the National Museum of the American Indian, where I work, and where incidentally, Ashley Minor is now a curator. She's a colleague of mine. I've actually known her for some time. We're actually hemispheric in scope. So we do focus a lot on the U.S., but our collection and our activities are so then it's many thousands of different groups. Yeah, but it's 500 plus in the U.S.
In the U.S. So I do have some questions from the chat. The first one is from a attendee, LaBrenda, who asked, she just ordered a copy of your book. Is that quote from John Ross in it?
No, it isn't. It was research that I discovered in the last several years, so it predates that book. The author that I'm citing in that is named Natalie Joy, a historian. I think she's at Northwestern. So I think she's explored that beyond this one text. So she would be a good person to look at.
So I'll repeat that. So it's Natalie Joy.
Correct.
Out of from Northwest University.
Actually, I think it's Northern Illinois or something like that.
Northern Illinois. Okay. Yeah. And then I have another question. They say it's hard to hear me, so I'll try to talk a little louder. That's usually not a problem for me. We have a longtime cultural and MPS advocate here, which I'm glad to say, Destry Jarvis. He asked, what do you think about Christopher Columbus statues on removal, or should they be reinterpreted?
I think I may have lost you for a minute.
Okay. One of our attendees, Destry Jarvis, asked, what do you think about Christopher Columbus statues, removal or reinterpretation?
Yeah, it was kind of shocking to see so many of them come down in 2020, because activists have been protesting those statues for a really long time. And it's just amazing how fast things can change. So museum, it's easy to say reinterpretation. I guess the way I think such people are so quick to look for an answer and a fix. I think all these things represent what a particular community thought was important at a certain time. Except that's not always true too, because we know about the Confederate memorials. Most of them weren't public projects. They weren't a community vote. It was a private organization providing funding to make it happen. And in some cases, that was true with Columbus statues. I think the real issue is, how does a community want to be represented now? So maybe the Columbus thing, nobody really cared, it was fine. But at some point, you get to say, well, it's true, I didn't care that our NFL team was called the Washington Redskins, but things change. And now we think it's a terrible way to represent our city, or the Cleveland Indians. So the thing about Columbus, though, there never was a huge constituency for it. It was like an Italian-American thing for a period of time. But there's not like people who are really upset about it, the same way I think Confederate statues or some others are. But I think it shows social progress to say, okay, this statue does not represent us very well anymore, and let's change it. In terms of reinterpretation, I think that varies by context and what you can do with it. I think sometimes it's sort of overkill to try to explain everything like that, and maybe just get rid of it sometimes.
So another thing, I don't have any more questions, but I from the chat, but I do have a question. You mentioned that 1830 was the Indian Removal Act, and that it's tied to Andrew Jackson. However, Jackson wasn't president. It was Jefferson. Did I hear you correct?
No, it was,
okay.
Yeah. So this is what we were trying to focus on, is like in the state of Georgia, in terms of their learning standards, you learn about removal, you learn about Andrew Jackson, you learn about John Ross, you learn about Trail of Tears, a certain narrative. And the way people understand it now is a very personalized, tragic tale, like most Indian things in history is tragedy. But removal, it actually took 7 presidential administrations for it to finally be completed. So it was a vast national project. So in 1839, when Trail of Tears happened, Jackson had served his 2 terms. He was out of office. So it's really trying to emphasize this became a national policy with Jackson as someone spearheading the effort. But
okay.
And it was a very narrow vote in the House and the Senate. Jefferson, obviously much earlier, he had written about, among the scenarios of what do we do with Indians, talking about removal in a certain context. So it was not like some dark genius just came up with this. It was a thread in the United States to say, what do we do with American Indians? And one thing that was always talked about was removal.
Oh, so I have a question. In your 2018 interview at the Smithsonian magazine about your exhibition, Americans, you addressed the role and responsibility of the curator and historian in telling difficult histories. Can you talk more about your strategies for being true to seemingly contradictions and deeply disturbing aspects of history without being either apologist or reactionary?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, a tough one. I think in the museum world, and I'm sure you've seen this too, Shante, in cultural organizations, difficult conversations tends to often be used as a code word for ideas and projects that make white people unhappy, or could be, right? That's what it means.
Right.
But what I expressed this afternoon isn't primarily about white people. It's about the idea African Americans and Native Americans are obvious natural allies. And that's, to me, I already know that many white people feel guilty if you talk about Trail of Tears. That's not interesting to me. White guilt has actually been devastating on Native policy in the 20th century in the US. Many of the worst policies of relocation, moving Indians from reservations to cities, or termination, actually getting federal status, they weren't right-wing zealots who were doing it. They usually were progressive-minded reformers who had these ideas. The boarding schools, which we look at through our 21st century's eyes, is so horrible. At that time, these were progressive ideas. I mean, AOC and Bernie Sanders would have been for it. You and I might have been for it. You know, it's really dangerous to look at things from the lens of the present all the time. So in this case, it wasn't like I sought out to highlight this one issue, but we knew that's where the scholarship was going with removal, that it was a huge American event, not simply about Indians as victims. And at the center were these 5 civilized tribes, so-called, and it was just completely unambiguous as to what they were, you know, about in terms of enslavement of human beings. So I thought a lot about what that meant. I mean, you know, Skip Gates has all the receipts about this persistent idea that many African-American families have indigenous histories in their family. And it no doubt happens sometimes, but he and others argue it was extremely rare because of the brutal realities of things. And it's not like in some cases, Native people and African-Americans were not allies, but in this moment, in this crucial moment, they were not. So I wanted to push back against that. The difficult conversation actually becomes, as I was saying about the code, things that aren't difficult at all, because everybody knows the drill of making white people feel guilty. Indians have been ripped off. That doesn't advance things. I'm trying to get things to where it's a really challenging issue, as someone who obviously wants solidarity between African Americans and Native Americans. We can't just skate past this kind of history, I think.
Which kind of leads into the next question from the audience. Keisha G asked, do you think reconciliation is necessary amongst people of African descent and Indians?
I guess I would have answered that differently at other times in my life. I just noticed how much we all did the word reckoning came up. And in 2020, there was just a zillion, words and TV shows and specials and actions and all of these things about a reckoning. But you can tell that energy is already fading quick. And I think the United States is a really, really complicated place. So to talk about some turning point, like it is significant to me, the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma has formally apologized and accepted the Black freedmen, as they're called, who were guaranteed citizenship in the Cherokee Nation, yet denied by tribal government after tribal government of the Cherokees up until very recently. That's important. That's good. I think it can happen in very specific cases. I think in terms of the kind of momentous change that those words imply, I don't know. I guess I don't even know what that looks like. I really don't.
Well, since you mentioned it, Roy E. Finkenbein asked, he's currently writing a book on freedom seekers and the Native Americans in the antebellum Midwest. I'm finding that certain peoples, and please excuse me because I probably won't pronounce these right, the Ottawa, Ojibwa, Stockbridge, Brotherton, Miami, Potawatomis, Wyandotte, Shawnee, etc. That's his statement. There were removed in a much more anti-slavery direction after 1800s, unlike their southern brethren. Was this a function of the emerging anti-slavery debate in their respective regions, localized indigenous beliefs, economic and cultural need, or other factors?
Well, what a great question. I'm not familiar with what was going on with those tribal nations at that time. I mean, certainly the starting point would be not to take from what happened with those 5 tribes in the South as representing other Indian nations at the same time. And also, it's one of the problems with the narrative of Indian history, which everyone wants, is that if you take 1865, the Indians that survived King Philip's War, the aftermath of what we know as Thanksgiving, all those things, they've been living in New England for 200 years in 1865. California Indians were, you know, very recently part of anything having to do with the U.S. Comanches, Kiowas, Apaches, they didn't have a frame of reference at all of something like African servitude, as Ross called it, but there was enslavement, sort of an equal opportunity enslavement of anybody. So, but what I like about the question is talking about a detailed set of folks at a certain time. So I look forward to learning more about that, but I don't have any insight on why that was true.
So we're getting really hot in our chat room, but I do want to say, because we're going to have to close that in a few minutes. So I'm going to try to combine 2 questions and allow you to answer them. So the first question is, well, I'm going to go first this way. Thank you for a fascinating talk. It's interesting to hear about your hesitation to bring in the darker, less uplifting, quote unquote, elements of history of Native Americans. I think it's also clear that you're taking a one-dimensional image of Native Americans as victims and making it more three-dimensional. What do you see as the potential effects of this shift in perspective? Now, just hold that right there, Paul. The next question, then it's kind of backwards, but I do think that they're relevant, is what does a future look like where we deal with the history and heal? And what kind of world do you want to see? So I'll let you answer those together because I think they're relevant before we get to our last question.
Yeah, and I thank you for putting those together because they certainly rhyme. You know, I used to have a lot more involved ideas of what my political views were on all of this. And, you know, I think in the end, I come out in this very sort of funny place that sounds so banal. But if I had to reduce it to one sentence, I would say I'm arguing that Indians are fully human. And of course, that sounds silly because who in 2022 would say Indians are not fully human? But I would suggest that when people refuse to look, you know, at this very challenging parts of our history and want to deny it, as I think a lot of Native intellectuals did for years about removal in the Civil War, you don't think Indians are fully human. Because if you felt Indians are fully human, you would agree Indians are capable every kind of horrific atrocity humans have ever committed in the 200,000 years since we've been human, every kind of act of nobility and grace and intelligence. That's what human beings are. And I think there's a certain part of the Native world that sees us as forest bunnies and doesn't want to hear anything negative that's actually true and resists anything that says, yeah, we did a lot of fantastically cool, wonderful things, and we did a lot of fantastically horrible things, just like any other group of people. So in a way, I end up in a very, you know, the line three-dimensional. That's what we're trying to get at. I mean, you know, I could talk about all this for hours in terms of this topic about Civil War and removal. But remember, most people in those nations, they didn't own slaves, right? Just the same way most white people in Mississippi didn't own slaves. I mean, a slave could cost as much as a Lamborghini. Slaves are very expensive, right? But that doesn't mean it's inaccurate to call them slave states. So always there's nuance, always there's complexity. But I do feel like if I have one project, it's to argue this very simple-minded, almost childish idea that Indians are fully human, because I think it's actually kind of a radical position.
Well, I wouldn't. You were saying it's a complex issue, and I don't mean to change or switch what you're saying. I have two more questions, but I did want to tell you this when you were talking about Native Americans owning slaves. Um, and how we can, as an oppressed people, we can sell each other out. We have to remember as African Americans that on the continent of Africa, that there were other Africans selling other Africans to the white, to the white slave traders. So we all are very complex people, especially when we get into the realm of oppression, power, and then when in the United States, we're talking about capitalism. So it can be very complicated. I will get to the last two questions here for the today is LaBrenda, who asked earlier. She's a genealogist working on a project with her nephew who had a Native American Y DNA and who has paternal forebears born in Oklahoma. So that was a statement more than a question. But the next question, which is relates to that, she says, "Will you touch on the connection?" This is another person, Keisha G asks, "Will you touch on the connection of wealth of Indians in Oklahoma and Black Tulsa?"
Yeah, that's a great question. I I'll say just quickly that it was. I remember when I was writing my last book, Tulsa was not widely known at all. It was just beginning to be known, and um, I thought the TV series Watchmen was really brilliant the way it brought that to a larger audience. So I'm interested in learning more about that. But one thing I can tell you is that the Black Wall Street of Black Tulsa in that era, many of those people actually were freedmen. They were tribal members of some of these tribes. So they were both indigenous and African American. And Tulsa itself was on the towns, I believe, a Chickasaw Choctaw town. Um, so there's a lot involved in I think it's a great place to really look at this beyond the narrative of whitey couldn't stand rich Black people and burn the town, to see how there's this complexity of indigenous, African American, and also money, particularly money, because in the early part of the 20th century, there were tons of Indians who couldn't wait to get rich and loved money and loved technology. And that's another myth, that we were always against that stuff. So I'm looking forward to more investigation on that. I myself have not looked into it closely, but I think it's a very rich area for people to learn about.
Well, Paul, that was the last question that we had on the chat. Um, I do want to ask you how we can reach you if we have any questions that deals with the subject matter of your scholar and your and the Smithsonian. What's the best way to reach you?
I'm easy to find on the internet. So if you want to reach
So
me.
just so that people will know, if they want to look you up on the internet, it is Paul, and the middle name is C as in Charlie, H as in Howard, double A T, pronounced Chaat. Am I correct?
Correct.
Smith. And he is presently at the curator at the National Museum of American Indians or Native Americans?
Yeah, it was interesting because you referenced it first as Native American, which people do all the time. And it's funny because a lot of people have the idea American Indian is a slur now, which most of us don't think it is, but it's a whole nother, it's the number one question we get, Native American or American Indian. The answer is both are fine, except some Indian people would say, no, Indian is bad. So there you go. Everything is a mess.
So yes, it is. It is a mess. I will tell you that because I've been in trouble many times, stepped in it because of African American versus Black American.
Right.
We are Black Americans,
Yes.
just like there are white Americans.
Yes.
But some people want to be identified as African Americans. So it is a complex world that we live in. Words are very complex. People are complex. So we have to work our way through the complexities. And the only thing that we can ask is that people be patient with us as we are now going through another phase with gender identity. People have to be patient. If
Yep.
I knew you as a her or a she, and then all of a sudden I see at the bottom of the screen it says they or them, I gotta do a mind change, and we have to be aware of that. And most people, at the end of the day, you have to admit, Paul, they want respect.
Yep.
They want to be respected, and so if we can learn how to respect each other, be mindful, ask the question, and being authentic and respectful, I think that we as a humanity will grow. And we all know that growth is not comfortable. That little seed coming out from the earth is doing a lot of work trying to get to the top to be a flower or a weed. And so I think that we really need to be a little bit more patient with one another and be respectful of each other. Paul, I cannot tell you how grateful we are to have you here. Um, let me see. Okay, I don't. We're gonna be shutting down here. I got one last question, and I want to take it, but I'm gonna have to close down the questions. Jackie asked, "Thank you for a fascinating talk. It's interesting to hear about your hesitation to bring it." Oh, I already said that one, didn't I? Yes, I did. Okay, I did my job. Can you stand that? Be patient, everyone. So Paul, we're gonna let you get back to your work. I hope that in the future you'll join us again. And for everybody out in the audience, I would like to tell you about another program that's coming live. Join us on May 13th for Voices of a Black Butterfly film. It was produced by the Baltimore National Heritage Area. We are glad to be partners with the Peel, and also this will be a great opportunity for you to see the inside of the Peel. But in addition to that, this great film, we are happy to say that our guest speaker for this program will be Dr. Lawrence T. Brown. And most of us in Baltimore know who he is. Dr. Brown wrote The Black Butterfly, The Harmful Politics of Race and Space in America. So we have restricted capacity due to COVID. So if you want to be in on that program, please go to the PILS website or go to BNHA's website and get your tickets and register for the event. There is a $15 donation that will go to the programs, the youth programs that are offered by BNHA. So we are delighted that everyone could attend today. Get outside, get some air, make sure you take your allergy pills. There's lots of pollen out there. It's still floating around. But have a great weekend and thank you so much. And I'll see you on May the 13th at the Peel.